Okay, so I'm redoing this video because apparently the first time I recorded it, it did not come through. So we're going to see if this one works better. So here you go. So we got 4 main objectives, and some of this will be review, some of this will not be. So to start off, we're going to talk about hypertrophy. So when you think of the word hypertrophy, what do you think of? And so just generally, hypertrophy means the enlargement of something. So if we're talking about muscle hypertrophy, we're talking about the fact that the muscle itself is increasing in size. Now, with muscle hypertrophy, there are 2 types. So there's transient and chronic. Now, transient, the word transient means something that kind of comes and goes. Okay, so with transient hypertrophy, this is hypertrophy that you'll have and then you won't. Okay, and so this is what occurs right after exercise. So this is sometimes referred to as the pump that you get. And so what's causing this is that fluid is moving. And so it's leaving the bloodstream, going into the interstitial space and going inside of the cells. This will only last for a short term because that fluid will eventually go back to the bloodstream. And so then you lose that enlargement. Then we've got chronic hypertrophy, and this is what most people are striving for when they're lifting weights and stuff. They're trying to make their muscles bigger to get stronger. And so this chronic hypertrophy occurs after a lot of training. And so what's happening, we're not just adding water or moving fluid around, but the structure of the muscle itself is changing. And there's 2 primary reasons that this can happen. One is hyperplasia, and the other is hypertrophy. We just refer to as hypertrophy. Ultimately, if we want to cause hypertrophy, we should use eccentric training because that will maximize our cross-sectional area. All right. Now, the difference between hypertrophy and hyperplasia is that hypertrophy, we're actually increasing the size of the muscle fiber itself. Whereas hyperplasia, we're increasing the number of actual muscle fibers or muscle cells that we have. Okay, and we're going to talk about each of these in a little more detail here. So, kind of the old school way of thinking was that in order to get big, you had to lift really, really heavy. Okay, so like 60 to 85% of max to get hypertrophy. Now, the newer research suggests that you can experience hypertrophy if you lift lighter, but what's important is that you have to lift to fatigue. If you don't lift to fatigue, which means when you're lifting to fatigue, that means you're using all of your motor units, or at least as many as you possibly can. And so what's going to happen is you're going to have that stimulus to cause hypertrophy. So the big thing is that we have to have fatiguing contractions in order to experience hypertrophy. Basically, like it says here, make your muscles tired. So with fiber hypertrophy, this is the one that we experience usually and perhaps all the time. For the most part, it appears that the number of muscle fibers that a person is born with is fixed at birth. So once you're born, you've got X number of muscle fibers, and that's how many you'll have. Okay, you won't increase it most likely, but I guess you could decrease it. And so what happens is when you go through training is that you have this individual hypertrophy. So each of these muscle fibers can get bigger because of protein synthesis. All right, and so what happens is we have more myofibrils, more actin and myosin, more sarcoplasm, more connective tissue. Okay, so when you think of muscle fiber, think of muscle cells. All right, and then we can have changes within that muscle cell to increase the size. This will eventually lead to, or as we change these variables, this will change the cross-sectional area that we have in the muscle. So our muscle gets bigger. And this occurs due to that increase in protein synthesis that's going on in your body after exercise, right? And so just kind of an aside here, you've probably all heard about the benefits of chocolate milk as a post-exercise drink because it has a good balance of carbs and protein and fats. The research is mixed on it, but for me, it's an excuse to drink chocolate milk. So there you go. So what causes hypertrophy is not completely understood. So it might be due to the release of hormones such as testosterone, growth hormone, insulin-like growth factor. But there's some research that says maybe these hormones aren't needed. And as I'll discuss, or as I discuss in a later video, hormones are just a complicated thing to study because there's so many potential interactions. There's so many different forms of a hormone, and and many different types of receptors. So it's really hard to kind of figure out. So if it isn't a hormonal signal, then there's probably something going on within the muscle itself. But I tend to believe that it's a combination of both, that it's not just one or the other. So on the other hand, we have hyperplasia. So this would be where we have an increase in number of muscle cells. This is something that's very difficult to study in humans. So there's animal studies that have been done that show that this happens, and it happens when these animals are put under heavy weight or heavy stress situations. Like I said, hard to study in humans because it's really hard to measure those and keep track of those. But it might be possible. And similar to these animal studies, if hyperplasia does exist in humans, it's going to require extremely high intensity training. So think like anaerobic training. So if and when it does happen, this is how it occurs. So muscle fibers do actually have the ability to divide and ultimately create a new functional muscle fiber, two functional muscle fibers. And in order for this process to occur, we have to use something called satellite cells. All right, and so I've got this little diagram out of the book that will help explain this. All right, so satellite cells normally are inactive, but once the muscle cell is injured, satellite cells are activated. Okay, so you can see here that something activates these muscle cells. So we've got muscle injury, activate the satellite cells. Sorry, I said muscle cells a minute ago. So we activate those satellite cells, and then what they do is they're attracted to the injured muscle fiber. Once they get there, they bind to this muscle fiber. Okay? And so what they then do is that they work with these damaged muscle fibers, and they ultimately cause the creation of a new myofibril or new myofiber along with its own central nuclei. Now, if you remember, muscle fibers have many, many nuclei, which will help with protein synthesis all along that muscle fiber. And so we get this central nuclei created. We have its own muscle fiber, and so we went from having one damaged muscle fiber to now we have two healthy muscle fibers. Okay? And then that process ends, and if hyperplasia occurs again, then we'll have those activation of those satellite cells. Now, as we've discussed a couple times, just a quick little refresher, that whenever someone experiences like short-term muscle strength or muscular strength gains, that's due to neural changes, such as autogenic inhibition, coactivation, recruitment, rate coding, things like that. But the long-term benefits are due to these muscular changes. Okay, so we get bigger. Once we get bigger and that sort of thing, we have to our nervous system has to figure out how to take advantage of this. Once it does, then we'll experience hypertrophy and then neural changes, so on and so forth. Okay, so this is a constant cycle. Last thing I want to discuss, or last two things, are atrophy and detraining. So remember, the muscle wants to be efficient, so we can experience atrophy or detraining. Now, there is a difference. Okay. Now, with atrophy, this is what happens when a muscle is completely immobilized. So like my son, when he broke his elbow last semester, his left arm, I think it was his left arm, was smaller in size than his right arm. And so that's because he was unable to use the muscle at all. And this causes quite a significant decrease in muscle size. But we can also have what's called detraining. And so this is where you're just not training to the same intensity. Okay, and so this happens over an extended period of time. What's interesting, though, about detraining compared to atrophy is that detraining, you're still using the muscle, just not as much, but it doesn't seem to have a whole lot of effect on cross-sectional area. So if you don't have as much change in that cross-sectional area, what's causing the decreases in strength? And the answer's got to be reduced neural drive. You're not able to send out those signals. You're becoming, you just don't have that ability. Now, what's really nice is that if you experience detraining, it's relatively easy to get those strength gains back. Now, you can, even in a time of detraining or where you're not trained as intensely, you can still maintain your strength if you use a maintenance program. And those are things that you likely talk about in PE 218 and 219. And so with that, we will end this second copy of this lecture.